The explosion ripped through the afternoon quiet with the force of a thunderclap, a brutal sound that tore the fabric of the vast, sun-scorched expanse. Dust and splinters of wood rained down on a landscape where the red sand glowed like embers under the unforgiving sun. Jace felt the tremor through the soles of his worn boots, a mile distant, where he was mending a stretch of fence line that wasn't his. He straightened his hand instinctively, going to the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip. His gaze sharp and narrowed against the glare fixed on the pillar of smoke and dust rising from the direction of Clara's ranch. His heart seized. For 2 years he had kept his distance, a solitary orbit around the woman who owned the silence in his soul. He was a drifter, a man haunted by the ghosts of his own making. And she was the widow of his best friend. But that violent plume of smoke was a summons he could not ignore. He threw his tools into his saddlebag, swung himself onto his horse, and dug in his heels. The animal surged forward, eating up the dry, cracked earth that separated him from her. He arrived to a scene of methodical devastation. The lifeblood of the ranch was a crater of splintered timber and churned mud. The air hung thick with the acrid smell of dynamite and scorched earth. And there she was standing amidst the ruin, a rifle held loosely in one hand. Clara. Her face was smudged with dirt, her dark hair had come loose from its pins, but her back was straight, her chin set in a line of furious defiance. She was shaken, but she was not broken. Clara Jace's voice was a low rasp, raw with a concern he had no right to show. She turned her eyes the color of a stormy sky finding his. There was no surprise in them, only a weary recognition. Jace, I figured you'd hear that. He dismounted his boots, crunching on the debris. His gaze swept the damage, his mind calculating the malice behind it. This wasn't a random act. This was a message. Who did this? Men I've never seen before, she said, her voice steady despite the tremor he saw in her hand. They told me Mr. Blackwood sends his regards. Said he was interested in acquiring this land, and that I should consider his offer before my luck runs out completely. Jace's jaw tightened. Silas Blackwood. The name was a whisper in the territory, a man who collected land the way a vulture collects bones. But to Jace, the name meant something else entirely. It was a phantom from a past that he had tried to bury deep. Are you hurt? He asked, his focus returning to her. Only my pride, she answered, a flicker of her old fire showing through. And my well. He walked with her toward the small ranch house, its porch paint peeling under the relentless sun. The air inside was still and heavy with the scent of dried herbs and old memories. Jace's presence seemed to shrink the space, his broad shoulders filling the doorway. As Clara moved to the kitchen to fetch water from a bucket, her emergency supply, his eyes were drawn to the mantelpiece. There it was, a framed photograph faded by the sun. 2 young men's arms slung around each other's shoulders, grinning with the unburdened optimism of youth. One was him, his face leaner, his eyes clearer. The other was Daniel, Clara's late husband, his best friend. The sight was a physical blow. The quiet room dissolved into a maelstrom of fire and smoke. A flash of orange flames licking at the ceiling of the Silver Creek bank. The roar was deafening, mixed with the panicked screams of townsfolk. Gunsmoke burned his lungs. He was younger then, a deputy with a shiny star and a belief in the simple line between right and wrong. He saw Daniel, his face pale, his eyes wide with a terror Jace had never seen before. A young man, barely a man at all, lay on the floor, his hands raised in surrender. Then a deafening crack of a gunshot that wasn't his own. The young man crumpled. Outside, a man's anguished cry echoed a father's cry. Silas Blackwood. Jace blinked, the vision receding, leaving behind the cold sweat of memory. He was back in Clara's house, the scent of lavender and dust grounding him. He could feel the grit of the plains between his teeth. The silence in the room was profound, broken only by the distant caw of a raven. He looked from the photograph of the smiling, living Daniel to the resolute woman standing before him. He had come here drawn by an explosion, but he knew now that he had been summoned by the past. And he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that he could not leave. Not this time. The days that followed fell into a grueling rhythm of repair and vigilance. Jace worked with a quiet, relentless energy, clearing the wreckage of the well. His movements were economical, his words sparse and measured. He was a man who spoke with his hands, with the solid thud of an axe splitting wood, or the steady turn of a winch. Clara worked alongside him, hauling buckets of water from the creek a half-mile away. Her resilience, a silent rebuke to the violence that had been done to her. They existed in a shared space of unspoken history. At night, they would sit on the porch, the vast star-pierced sky stretching above them. The air between them was thick with things left unsaid. He was the ghost of her husband's past, and she was a future he felt he had no claim to. "You don't have to stay, Jace," she said one evening, her voice soft against the chirping of crickets. "This isn't your fight." "It is now," he replied, his gaze fixed on the dark horizon. He didn't elaborate. He couldn't. How could he explain that Silas Blackwood was not just some greedy landowner, that the attack on her ranch was a message meant only for him, a new chapter in a story written in blood 5 years ago? The town of redemption watched them with wary eyes. It was a place of dusty streets and hushed gossip, where survival depended on not drawing unwanted attention. The sheriff, a man named Miller, with a perpetually weary face and a gut that strained the buttons of his shirt, had paid a visit. He'd surveyed the damage, tipped his hat, and offered his sympathies. "Blackwood's got deep pockets," Clara Miller had said, avoiding Jace's gaze. "He's got the law on his side, or at least the kind of law money can buy. Be careful." It was a warning masquerading as advice. The town offered no sanctuary. Jace saw Blackwood's men whenever he rode in for supplies. They were hard-faced thugs who loitered outside the saloon, their confidence an ugly stain on the town's fragile peace. They never approached him directly, but their eyes followed him, cold and assessing. Jace met their stares with a stony indifference that concealed the cold knot of dread in his stomach. He was a man who had spent years running from his ghosts, and now they had come riding for him. He began to fortify the ranch. He reinforced the barn doors, checked the sight lines from the house, and spent hours cleaning his Colt and the Winchester he kept in his saddle scabbard. He was moving back into a world he had tried to leave behind, the world of a lawman where every shadow could hold a threat. Clara watched him, her expression a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. She knew Jace was hiding something. She could see it in the way he would fall silent when she spoke of Daniel, and the haunted look that would cross his face when he thought she wasn't looking. "Daniel told me about you," she said one afternoon as they shared a meager meal of bread and jerky. "He said you were the truest friend he ever had. Said you were the bravest man he knew." Jace's fork stilled. The bread turned to ash in his mouth. Brave. The word was a hot brand on his conscience. He had spent 5 years propping up the memory of a hero for her, a lie of omission that had become a wall between them. Daniel had been his friend, yes, but on that terrible day in Silver Creek, he had been something else too. He was a good man, Jace said, the words feeling hollow and false. He couldn't meet her eyes. Their fragile peace was shattered a week later. It happened not with the roar of dynamite, but with the chillingly formal arrival of a buggy. Seated within it was a man dressed in a fine black suit that seemed to absorb the sunlight, his silver hair neatly combed. His face was a mask of cold patrician arrogance. Silas Blackwood had come in person. He did not get out of the buggy. He simply sat there, his gloved hands resting on a silver-headed cane, while two of his men stood guard. Clara and Jace came out onto the porch, Jace positioning himself slightly in front of her. Mrs. Daniels Blackwood's voice was eloquent, cultured, a jarring contrast to the brutal landscape. It carried a theatrical resonance that made the hairs on Jace's arms stand up. "I trust you have had time to reconsider my generous offer for this rustic parcel of land." His eyes, pale and chillingly intelligent, flicked from Clara to Jace. A flicker of recognition, of ancient hatred passed between them. "This land is not for sale," Clara said, her voice clear and strong. Blackwood smiled, a thin, bloodless stretching of his lips. "Everything is for sale, my dear. It is merely a matter of price. Some prices are paid in gold. Others—" he let his gaze linger on Jace. "Others are paid in sorrow. A storm is coming for this valley, ma'am. Some things once broken cannot be rebuilt. I urge you to leave before you find yourself swept away." The threat was unmistakable, a silken promise of ruin. It wasn't about the land. Jace saw it clearly now. It was about him. Every word Blackwood spoke to Clara was a poisoned dart aimed at his own heart. As the buggy turned and rolled away, leaving a cloud of dust in its wake, Jace felt a profound shift within him. His solitary drift was over. He was no longer a man helping a friend's widow. He was a shield standing between a woman he was beginning to care for and a monster from his past. He had to stay. He had to fight. For the first time in 5 years, running was not an option. The attack came at night, under the sliver of a new moon. Jace had been expecting it. He'd spent the evening on the porch, his Winchester resting across his lap, watching the shadows lengthen and deepen into an impenetrable blackness. He had insisted Clara stay inside her own rifle, loaded and ready by the window. The silence of the prairie was a taut wire, humming with unseen menace. It began not with a gunshot, but with the frantic, terrified lowing of cattle. Blackwood's men were trying to scatter her herd, to destroy her livelihood piece by piece. Jace moved from the porch in a silent crouch, melting into the deeper darkness along the fence line. He was a phantom, his steps sure and quiet on the hard-packed earth. 3 riders were cutting through the herd, their whoops and hollers slicing through the night. A 4th was near the barn, a torch in his hand, its flickering light painting his face in demonic shades of orange and red. The barn. It was the heart of the ranch, filled with hay for the winter, a season of life or death on the plains. Jace raised the Winchester to his shoulder, the cold stock a familiar comfort against his cheek. He didn't aim to kill. Not yet. He fired a single shot, the bullet whining past the ear of the man with the torch. The man yelped, dropping the brand, which sputtered and died in the dust. The other 3 riders reined in sharply, their silhouettes stark against the starlit sky. "Get off this land," Jace's voice cut through the darkness, cold and hard as iron. A shot answered him, the muzzle flash, a brief angry flower in the night. The bullet splintered the fence post beside his head. The fight was on. Jace fired again this time, aiming for a horse's flank. The animal screamed and bucked, throwing its rider. From the house, a rifle cracked Clara. She was a crack shot, Daniel had always said. Her bullet tore through the hat of another rider, who cursed and spurred his horse back toward the darkness. The battle was short, sharp, and brutal. It was a chaotic dance of shadows and gunfire. Jace moved with a deadly efficiency that came from a part of his life he had tried to forget. He was no longer a drifter. He was the lawman he used to be, a protector, standing his ground. Outnumbered and with one of their own, unhorsed, the remaining riders retreated, firing wildly into the night as they fled. Silence descended once more, heavy and ringing. Jace stayed low for a long time, his senses straining, listening for any sound of their return. When he was certain they were gone, he walked back toward the house, his rifle held ready. Clara met him on the porch, her face pale in the faint moonlight. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," he said, his eyes scanning the darkness. "They're gone. For now." They spent the rest of the night on watch, but the attackers did not return. As the first pale light of dawn crept over the horizon, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and gray, the full cost of the night became clear. Several cattle were missing, and a section of fence was torn down. But the barn still stood. Jace walked towards it, a feeling of grim relief settling in his chest. But as he got closer, he saw something glinting against the dark wood of the main door. He stopped, his blood running cold. Pinned to the door by a large, cruel-looking knife was a tarnished, bent piece of metal. A deputy's star. His deputy's star. The one he had thrown into the dust of Silver Creek 5 years ago, believing he was leaving that life and that failure behind him. He reached out a trembling hand and pulled the knife from the wood. He held the star in his palm. It was a relic from a buried life, a symbol of his guilt. Blackwood hadn't just sent his men to attack the ranch. He had sent them to deliver a message directly to Jace. This was not about land. This was not about money. This was a reckoning. And Silas Blackwood knew exactly who he was. The discovery of the deputy's star changed everything. It was no longer a symbol of a forgotten past, but a declaration of war. Jace carried its weight in his pocket, a constant cold reminder of the debt that had come due. He knew he could no longer protect Clara by simply defending her land. He had to understand the man who was hunting him. He had to uncover the full scope of Silas Blackwood's vengeance. "I have to ride out for a couple of days," he told Clara the next morning. He didn't explain why, and she didn't ask. She saw the grim set of his jaw, the new darkness in his eyes. She simply nodded. "Be careful, Jace," she said, her voice laced with an emotion he couldn't quite name. He rode west toward the foothills that bordered the territory to a town called Dusty Hollow, a place where information was a currency as valuable as gold. He sought out an old contact, a grizzled ex-ranger named Elias, who now ran a livery stable. Elias had ears everywhere. Over a bottle of cheap whiskey in a back room that smelled of hay and horsehide, Jace laid the star on the table. Elias picked it up, his one good eye narrowing as he examined it. Silver Creek Marshal's office. Elias grunted. "Haven't seen one of these in years. Not since that botched bank job." "I was there," Jace said, his voice flat. Elias looked at him, a new understanding dawning in his eye. "I heard about that. 2 deputies and a dead boy. The boy's father was a big man in those parts. Silas Blackwood." "He's here now," Jace said. "He's buying up land in the Redemption Valley, using force when folks won't sell." "That ain't all he's doing," Elias said, leaning forward. "Blackwood lost everything after his son died. His wife passed from grief, his businesses failed. He disappeared for a few years. When he came back, he was a different man. He's not building an empire, Jace. He's building a monument to his own hate. The folks he's pushing out, I've been hearing whispers. They all have some connection, however small, to that day in Silver Creek. A man who was on the jury that cleared you deputies. A banker who testified. Blackwood is systematically destroying the lives of anyone he blames for his son's death." The whiskey soured in Jace's stomach. This was a vendetta meticulously planned and executed. He wasn't just the next target, he was the final one. The main one. "And the other deputy," Elias asked, his voice low. "The one who..." Left town right after. Daniel Jace said the name a stone in his throat. He's dead. Died of a fever 2 years back. It's his widow's ranch Blackwood is after. Elias let out a long, slow breath. Then Blackwood sees her as the last piece of the puzzle. The last thing he can take from a man he can no longer touch. And from you. Jace rode back to the ranch with a heavy heart. The truth was worse than he had imagined. He was the lightning rod, and Clara was standing right next to him in the middle of the storm. Back at the ranch, a fragile intimacy was growing between them in the shadow of the looming threat. They worked side by side, their hands, sometimes brushing as they mended a fence or stacked firewood. They were two solitary souls bound by a shared crisis, finding a strange comfort in each other's presence. One evening, exhausted from a day of backbreaking labor, they sat on the porch steps, watching the sun bleed across the horizon. "Tell me about him," Clara said softly, breaking the long silence. "Tell me about the Daniel you knew. Before me." Jace's whole body tensed. He wanted to give her stories of their youth, of their shared dreams of bringing justice to a lawless land. But every memory was tainted by the secret he kept, the lie he had protected for 5 years. He told her about their first patrol, about how Daniel had once faced down 3 drunken cowboys with nothing but a sharp tongue and a steady gaze. He painted a portrait of a hero, the man he knew she needed to remember. "He always wanted to be a hero," Jace finished, his voice rough. "He was," Clara whispered, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "He was my hero." She leaned her head against his shoulder, a simple, trusting gesture that felt both wonderful and agonizing. He wanted to put his arm around her, to pull her close and tell her everything. To confess that Daniel had been brave, yes, but he had also been terrified. That in one crucial, fatal moment, his fear had won. But he couldn't. The truth would shatter the image of the man she loved, and he couldn't bring himself to be the one to do it. So he sat there rigid and silent, the weight of his deception, a chasm between them. Clara must have sensed his withdrawal, because she straightened up, a flicker of hurt in her eyes, and the moment was lost. He saw the questions growing in her gaze day by day. She was no fool. She noticed the tarnished star he now kept in his shirt pocket, taking it out to stare at when he thought he was alone. She saw the way his hand drifted to his gun whenever riders appeared on the horizon. She knew the fight for her ranch had become something deeply personal for him. The confirmation Jace had dreaded arrived in the form of a letter delivered by a traveling preacher who passed through the valley. It was from Elias. It was short and to the point. "His name is Silas Blackwood. His son was Thomas Blackwood. Died in the Silver Creek bank robbery 5 years ago. You know the rest. He's not just coming for the land, Jace. He's coming for you. Get her out of there." Jace read the letter, his knuckles white as he crumpled the paper. Silas Blackwood. Thomas Blackwood. The names brought the past crashing back with the force of a physical blow. He remembered Silas's face at the inquest, a mask of cold, bottomless grief. He remembered the man's whispered vow as Jace and Daniel were cleared of wrongdoing. There are other courts, other forms of justice. This was it, the midpoint, the moment the battle for a piece of land transformed irrevocably into a war for atonement. Every act of violence, every threat, had been a deliberate step in a dance of revenge. And Silas was leading him to the final fatal turn. This was no longer about protecting Clara's ranch. It was about surviving a reckoning he had been running from for half a decade. He walked back to the house, the crumpled letter a lead weight in his hand. He found Clara in the barn, pitching hay. She stopped when she saw his face. "What is it?" she asked, her voice tight with apprehension. "We have to prepare," he said, his own voice sounding distant hollow. Blackwood isn't going to stop. He's not going to send his men next time. He'll come himself. Why, Jace? She demanded, stepping closer, her patience finally exhausted. Why is he doing this? This is more than just land. I see it in your eyes. This is about you. You need to tell me the truth. He looked at her, at the fierce intelligence and the deep well of strength in her gaze. He owed her the truth. But the words caught in his throat. The lie he had nurtured for so long, the lie that protected the memory of her husband, was the last shield he had. He couldn't bring it down. Not yet. I will, he promised, the words, tasting like a fresh betrayal. When this is over, I promise. He turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the dusty barn, and the chasm between them wider and deeper than ever. He had to end this. He had to face Silas Blackwood and the ghosts of Silver Creek once and for all. Silas Blackwood, it turned out, was a master of psychological warfare. He knew Jace was waiting for a direct assault, a final violent confrontation. So he did something far crueler. He attacked the town. It started with a fire at the livery stable, a deliberate act of arson that sent a column of black smoke into the pristine blue sky. The town's volunteer fire bucket brigade was slow and disorganized. Jace, seeing the smoke from the ranch, didn't hesitate. Stay here. Bar the door. Don't open it for anyone, he commanded Clara, his face a grim mask. He saddled his horse and rode hard for redemption, his instincts screaming that this was a trap. The town was in chaos. Men shouted, horses whinnied in terror, and the heat from the blaze was a physical force. Jace joined the line, helping to pass buckets, his eyes constantly scanning the crowds, looking for Blackwood's men, for the architect of this misery. But he saw nothing. The fire was a diversion, a perfectly executed piece of misdirection. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. This wasn't about the town. It was about getting him away from the ranch. Away from Clara. He dropped his bucket and ran for his horse, vaulting into the saddle. He spurred the animal into a desperate gallop, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The ride back was an agony of fear and self-recrimination. He had let his guard down. He had walked right into the trap. He saw the buggy from a half-mile out, parked in front of the ranch house like a black hearse. His blood ran cold. He pushed his horse harder, the animal's lungs heaving. He arrived to a scene of profound and terrible stillness. The front door of the house was wide open. There was no sign of a struggle. On the porch, rocking gently in the breeze, was Clara's favorite rocking chair. It was empty. Jace dismounted, his Colt in his hand, every nerve screaming. He entered the house, his boots echoing on the wooden floors. Everything was neat, tidy. Too tidy. On the kitchen table, placed squarely in the center, was a single folded piece of paper. His name was written on it in elegant, spidery script. He unfolded it. The message was simple. A soul for a soul. Come to where it all ended, the old church at Silver Creek. Come alone, or the widow pays the price for your friend's cowardice. Your friend's cowardice. The words were a venomous strike aimed at the heart of his secret. Silas knew. He knew everything. He hadn't simply taken Clara as a hostage. He had taken her as a weapon to be used against Jace. He had forced the confrontation not on Jace's terms in the open land he knew so well, but in the one place Jace never wanted to see again. The ghost town of Silver Creek. The place where his world had broken apart. There was no choice. He checked his Colt, grabbed his Winchester and a box of cartridges, and walked out of the empty house that had briefly felt like a home. The sky to the west was darkening, the wind picking up, carrying the first stinging grains of sand. A storm was brewing, a physical manifestation of the tempest that was about to break. He mounted his horse, then rode toward the ruins of his past, a solitary figure against a horizon of gathering fury. The ride to Silver Creek was a journey into a storm, both literal and metaphorical. The wind howled a mournful dirge that whipped sand into Jace's face, stinging his eyes and gritting between his teeth. The sky turned a sickly yellow-brown, the sun a dim, forgotten coin. The world shrank to the space immediately around him, a swirling vortex of dust and despair. It was as if the heavens themselves were trying to scour the land of its sins. Silver Creek was a skeleton of a town, its buildings crumbling, its main street choked with sand. At the far end stood the church, its steeple a jagged finger pointing at the angry sky. Beside it lay the blackened, skeletal ruins of the bank. This was the epicenter of his guilt, the place where the ghosts of his past walked. He dismounted, tethering his horse to a hitching post that threatened to collapse. The church door creaked open on rusted hinges as he pushed it. The interior was a cavern of shadows and swirling dust. Light struggled through the boarded-up windows, illuminating dancing motes in the gloom. At the far end of the nave, by the derelict altar, stood Silas Blackwood. Clara was beside him, her hands tied a gag across her mouth. Her eyes were wide, fixed on Jace, a mixture of fear and a desperate unspoken plea. "Welcome, Deputy Silas," said his voice, echoing in the cavernous space. He was impeccably dressed, a pillar of dark civility in the heart of chaos. "I am so pleased you could attend this final sermon." "Let her go, Blackwood," Jace said, his voice low and steady, his Winchester held at his side. "This is between you and me." Silas laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "Oh, it has always been between you and me. But she is the scripture. She is the lesson. You took my son Jace, my Thomas, a boy with his whole life ahead of him. So now I take what you have begun to love, a soul for a soul. It is biblical in its simplicity." "Your son was robbing a bank," Jace stated, the words tasting like old lies. "My son was misguided. A foolish boy who made a mistake." Silas roared, his composure cracking for a moment, revealing the raw, festering wound beneath. He regained control, smoothing his coat. He had surrendered, Jace. Did you know that his hands were in the air? He was no longer a threat. Jace's hand tightened on his rifle. This was it, the moment of truth. "It was my fault," Jace said, taking a step forward. "I was the senior deputy. The responsibility was mine." He was trying to shield Daniel even now, trying to protect his memory for Clara. Silas let out a chilling, pitying laugh. "You think you're the noble hero even at the end, protecting the memory of your fallen friend." He turned his cold eyes on Clara. "Your husband, madam, the man you mourn as a hero, was a coward." Clara flinched as if struck. "My boy had surrendered," Silas continued, his voice a venomous whisper. "But your husband, Daniel?" He panicked. He was terrified. I saw his face through the window just before the fire started, and in his terror he fired. An unnecessary shot. A fatal one. That is why my son is dead. Not because of a robbery, but because of the weakness of the man you loved. The truth, when it finally came, was a physical blow. Jace saw the devastation in Clara's eyes, the shattering of a memory she had held sacred. All his lies, all his omissions were stripped bare in the swirling dust of that forsaken church. "Jace, is it true?" Clara's voice was muffled by the gag, her eyes begging him for a denial that he could not give. He could only nod, a slow, agonizing admission of his deception. In that moment of shared shock, Silas moved. He drew a pistol from his coat and fired. Not at Jace, but at the rope, holding a heavy chandelier above them. The rope snapped, and the massive iron fixture crashed to the floor, sending up a shower of sparks and dust, creating a barrier between them. The church exploded into a chaotic battle. Silas used the pews as cover, firing blindly into the swirling dust. The sandstorm raged outside, making the light fail, plunging the room into a disorienting twilight. Jace dove behind the fallen chandelier, the world a maelstrom of howling wind, splintering wood, and the deafening roar of gunshots. He was fighting for Clara's life, but he was also fighting the ghosts of his own making. He had to survive not just to save her, but to earn the right to tell her the rest of the story, to beg for a forgiveness he did not deserve. He chambered around the metallic click, a small, hard sound of resolve in the heart of the storm. The final reckoning had begun. The air was a choking mix of dust and cordite. Visibility was almost zero. Jace moved in a low crouch, using the overturned pews for cover his senses, straining to pinpoint Blackwood's position in the swirling gloom. A muzzle flash from the direction of the altar gave him a target. He fired back the Winchester's report, a deafening crack that echoed through the nave. Wood splintered near where Silas was hiding. "You protected him." Blackwood's voice was a disembodied howl carried on the wind. "You let the world think he was a hero, and you let me believe you were the one who pulled the trigger. You stole my vengeance." Jace scrambled to a new position, his mind racing. He had to get to Clara. He saw her struggling against her bonds near the altar, her eyes wide with terror. Another shot from Silas whizzed past Jace's ear. He was pinned down. He had to change the fight. He holstered his Colt and pulled the knife from his boot, the same one that had pinned his star to the barn door. He began to crawl silent as a cat through the debris-strewn aisle. The howling wind covered the sound of his movement. He circled around the edge of the room, using the confessional booth as a shield. He saw Blackwood now, a dark shape, reloading his pistol, his back to Jace. This was his chance. He lunged from the shadows, a wraith of dust and fury. He tackled Blackwood, and the two men went down in a tangle of limbs. The pistol clattered away into the darkness. The fight was raw, primal. It was not a clean contest of skill, but a desperate, brutal struggle for survival. They rolled on the floor, trading blows that landed with sickening thuds. Blackwood was surprisingly strong, fueled by years of cold, simmering rage. His fingers clawed at Jace's eyes. Jace slammed his palm into Blackwood's nose, feeling the crunch of cartilage. A lucky blow from Blackwood caught Jace in the ribs, sending a lance of pure agony through his side. He gasped for air, his vision swimming. Blackwood scrambled for his fallen gun. Jace kicked out his boot, connecting with the pistol and sending it skittering further into the shadows. He surged to his feet, pulling a wounded Blackwood up by his coat front. "It's over, Silas." He rasped, his breath coming in ragged bursts. "There's been enough death." "Not until my son is avenged," Blackwood snarled, pulling a derringer from an ankle holster. Jace didn't have time to react, but Clara did. Having finally worked one hand free, she lunged forward and shoved a heavy wooden lectern with all her might. It toppled over, crashing into Blackwood and knocking him off balance. The derringer fired the small bullet, burying itself harmlessly in the church ceiling. The momentary distraction was all Jace needed. He disarmed Blackwood, twisting the man's arm behind his back and forcing him to his knees. The fight was done. The storm outside began to subside, its fury spent. A weak, watery light filtered back into the church, illuminating the scene of devastation. Jace stood over the defeated Silas Blackwood, breathing heavily, his side a symphony of pain. He looked at Clara, who was now free of her bonds, her face a mask of shock grief. and something else he couldn't yet read. The truth lay between them, stark and unavoidable, in the sudden ringing silence. The ride back to the ranch was a long, heavy silence. Jace had bound Blackwood and left him for the U.S. Marshals he knew would be tracking the man's violent path. He was wounded a deep gash in his side, staunched by a makeshift bandage, every movement an exercise in pain. But the physical hurt was nothing compared to the weight of Clara's quiet presence beside him. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and raw, where all secrets had been laid bare. They reached the ranch as dusk settled the air, cool and calm. Inside the house, Clara lit a lamp, its gentle glow pushing back the shadows. She insisted on tending to his wound, her touch gentle and clinical as she cleaned and stitched the gash. Neither of them spoke. The silence was a fragile thing filled with the ghosts of Daniel and Thomas Blackwood, of lies told and truths shattered. Finally, when she was done, they sat at the kitchen table, the lamp casting long shadows on their faces. "You should have told me," she said, her voice barely a whisper. It held no anger, only a profound, bottomless sorrow. "I know," Jace said, his own voice rough with regret. "I wanted to protect you. To protect his memory for you. Protect me." She looked at him, her eyes glistening. "Jace, I loved a man who didn't exist. You didn't protect me. You kept me in a prison of a perfect memory. I had a right to know who my husband was. The real man. The good and the bad." He had no defense. She was right. "Daniel was my friend," he said, the words aching their way out. "He was a good man who made a terrible mistake in a moment of fear. He never forgave himself for it. After the inquest, he was never the same. He couldn't live with what he'd done. And I couldn't bear to see your heart break a second time. It was a coward's choice. My choice." He finally told her everything. He told her about Daniel's nightmares, about his quiet despair in the months following the shooting. He explained how Daniel had resigned his commission and drifted, trying to outrun his own guilt, eventually settling here with her, seeking a peace he never truly found. Clara listened, tears streaming silently down her face. She was not just mourning the lie. She was mourning the man Daniel truly was, flawed, haunted, and human. A man who had suffered alone with his shame. "All those years," she murmured, "I thought his sadness was because he missed his old life. I never knew." The confession hung in the air between them, raw and painful. It was not a balm, not an immediate absolution. It was a necessary amputation, cutting away the diseased part of their shared history so that something new, something honest, could have a chance to grow. The future was uncertain. The trust between them was a fragile newborn thing. But for the first time, there were no more secrets. Months passed. The seasons turned. Silas Blackwood was tried and sent to a federal prison, his reign of vengeful terror over. The valley slowly began to heal. Jace stayed. He and Clara worked the ranch, rebuilding what had been broken. The well was new, the barn was sturdy, and the fences were strong. They worked in a quiet companionship, and the space between them slowly filling not with words, but with shared labor, mutual respect, and the slow, tentative rebuilding of trust. The passion of their first days was gone, replaced by something deeper, more resilient, forged in truth and sorrow. One cool autumn afternoon, while cleaning out an old trunk of Daniel's things to make space, Clara's hand brushed against a loose floorboard beneath it. Prying it up, she found a small, hidden compartment. Inside was a worn leather journal and a single sealed envelope addressed to her. Her hands trembled as she opened it. It was Daniel's handwriting. The letter was dated just a week before the fever took him. "My dearest Clara, It began. If you are reading this, it means my own courage has failed me once again. There is a shadow I have carried since before we met, a stain on my soul, I must confess. It concerns a young man's death in Silver Creek and my part in it. It was not an act of justice, but a moment of profound and regrettable fear. Jace, my truest friend, has carried the burden of this secret to protect my name. But the lie does you a disservice. I was not the hero you believe me to be. My only hope is that you can forgive the flawed man I truly was, and that one day you will find a happiness unburdened by the ghosts of my past. I have always loved you. Forgive me. Daniel. Tears fell onto the brittle paper. The letter was a final, painful gift. It was Daniel's confession granting her permission to let go of the idealized phantom she had clung to. It granted Jace absolution, freeing him from his self-imposed role as keeper of a lie. It was the final piece of closure. That evening, she showed the letter to Jace. He read it, and a weight he had carried for 5 long years finally lifted from his shoulders. They didn't need to speak. Everything had been said. Later, they stood on the porch looking out at the land they had fought for. Jace reached into his pocket and pulled out his father's old silver pocket watch, the only heirloom he owned. He walked inside and placed it on the mantelpiece, right next to the framed photograph of him and Daniel. It was a gesture of union, a joining of their pasts to create a shared future. Clara came and stood beside him, her hand finding his. They looked at the two objects, the smiling memory of a flawed, forgiven friend, and the promise of a future built on hard-won truth. Outside, the sun was setting, casting a golden glow across the plains, illuminating the new foundation stones of the rebuilt barn. They were not riding into the sunset, but standing their ground, two souls scarred, but not broken, ready to build a life together on the land that was finally theirs.